Well, thank you very much everyone for coming, and thank you Jocelyn for that introduction. So when given the opportunity to talk today, I decided to speak about a topic that I had a long interest in but never done any research on. I used to teach environmental history at the University of Tasmania, and I often talked about in the lectures about acclimatisation in Australia in the 19th century, but never had anything that had been written about Tasmania's experience, just snippets. So today I offer you a bespoke talk purely for today based on new research that I think fits in with Clive Lord's twin interests of science and history. Although you will no doubt at the end say there wasn't much science in that talk. So let's start. So in his seminal book, They All Ran Wild, first published in 1969, farmer and environmentalist Eric Rolls described members of acclimatisation societies in damning terms. There was never a body of eminent men so foolishly, so vigorously and so disastrously wrong. Rolls referred to the exotic or foreign animals and plants that these members introduced in the mid-19th century, and declared that only lack of money and the failure of some of the animals to adapt saved Australia from these societies' worst enthusiasms. Now, Rolls was mainly directing his criticisms at the Acclimatisation Society of Victoria, ASV, which received the most financial and political backing of any of the acclimatisation societies that were formed in New South Wales, Tasmania, South Australia, Queensland and New Zealand from about 1860 to 1875. And thereafter these societies tended to decline, struggled to find funds, became administratively lacking in one way or another, while some disappeared or changed emphasis. But the idea of acclimatisation did not disappear and continued to have adherents to the end of the century and really beyond. In fact, after 1860, acclimatisation was not confined to members of acclimatisation societies or scientists, as Minard, offering a more nuanced perspective of the ASV and acclimatisation in general, in his book in 2019, noted that farmers, pastoralists, hunters, recreational and commercial fishermen, businessmen and journalists, among others, contributed to, transformed and conditioned the social practice and science of acclimatisation. He points out that some animals that became pests, like deer, rabbits, cats and foxes, had been introduced by early colonists before the formation of acclimatisation societies. Moreover, after 1860, leading naturalists and acclimatisation theorists of the ASV did not seek to harm the local environment, were not simply alienated from Australian nature, and, he stresses, were generally believed in an acclimatisation practice that combined restoring and improving nature for everyone with animals from Britain, Europe, Asia, South America and Africa. British species predominated because they were, Minard claims, easy to acquire in large numbers, not because of an overwhelming desire to transform the Australian colonies into a facsimile of Britain. Now that applies to Victoria, not necessarily to Tasmania, as you'll see. When introduced animals reacted in new and unpredictable ways, they demonstrated the limits of scientific knowledge, how adaptable they were, and how vulnerable native species and the Australian landscape were to the new arrivals. So what I'm going to talk about today focuses on Tasmania's relatively unstudied acclimatisation experience with animals and birds, which was similar in some ways to Victoria's from 1860. So Tasmania experienced acclimatisation of both domesticated and exotic animals and birds by early colonists. Its acclimatisation society was in fact based on the ASV model, but with much less government support. British species were the most sought after, but some animals and birds did come from Asia. and a number of birds and animals became pests, just as in Victoria, and Rolls complained of. But the differences between Victorian and Tasmanian acclimatisation efforts need to be kept in mind as I discuss what Tasmanian acclimatisers achieved in the body, as I go on with this paper. So I thought I'd start as a typical historian's procedure of giving you 6 general points for context purposes. First, while Tasmania had a tradition of amateur scientific study through scientific societies like the Tasmanian Society and the Royal Society of Tasmania, their members constituted only a small number of essentially amateur scientists. The University of Melbourne had been established in 1853, but the University of Tasmania was 4 decades away, and Tasmania had a dearth of well-trained scientists able to theorise about acclimatisation and its consequences as occurred in Victoria. Tasmanian acclimatisers, arguably, were not motivated by scientific theory, but introduced new animals and birds into Tasmania for practical, economic and cultural purposes. Cultural needs stressing. Nonetheless, whether in the papers and proceedings of the Royal Society of Tasmania or in newspapers, the deleterious impact of some introduced species was analysed and disillusionment with acclimatisation was expressed, especially in the 1890s. Second, again arguably, of all the Australian colonies, as the Mercury put it, Tasmania was best placed for successful acclimatisation. We possess a climate in which any form of animal may thrive, a vegetation suited to most, an abundance of all land and water conveniences, bush and plain, shallows and deeps, smooth water and currents, a home for the multiform bounties of nature. So on this reading, Tasmania was the perfect laboratory for the Tasmanian Acclimatisation Society. So when I say the Tas, you will know to save me saying Tasmanian Acclimatisation Society. And of course, private individuals, sometimes working together to experiment with introduced animals. So the Tas usually rates no more than a passing reference in acclimatisation literature, but this talk demonstrates that it was more active from its formation in 1862 to about 1876 than previously thought, largely due to the enthusiasm of local lawyer John Woodcock Graves, who I'll come back to, and some farmers and politicians. And this supports Osborne's observation that often political and financial support for acclimatisation depended on a few key people. Osborne further observed that for British acclimatisers, acclimatisation tended to signify a transfer of so-called exotic organisms from one location to another with a similar climate. And the Australian colony with the climate most approximating Britain's was Tasmania. So this was a major reason why British birds and animals were favoured by Tasmanian acclimatisers, who avoided the more outlandish animals from places like Africa and South America. Third, Tasmania had not undergone the explosion of population that Victoria did after the gold rushes with their consequent destruction of the environment. Certainly the rapid growth of sheep farming, so vital to our economy, had wrought changes to the Tasmanian landscape, but intensive mining and forestry had not yet developed. Sheep farmers faced much destruction from rabbits, but opposed dangerous solutions like introducing foxes that might attack their sheep and not the rabbits. 4. From 1858 to 1872, Tasmania suffered an economic depression, a very long depression, and desperately needed to attract new business ventures. Acclimatising animals that added something new to the economy, like alpacas, llamas and Angora goats, was generally supported. Introducing birds that could deal more effectively with insect pests and strengthen the viability of orchards were supported by agriculturalists and gardeners. But of course, sparrows and starlings also became pests themselves. While American environmental historian Thomas Dunlap is right to argue that sentiment and sport were the dominant motives in Australian acclimatisation, In Tasmania's case, it is not true, as he claims, that economic rationales were conspicuous by their absence. 5. Tasmania, first settled as a penal colony, suffered the stigma of its origins long after the 1850s and actively sought to change its image to one more befitting of a typical British imperial colony. And in her 2008 PhD thesis, Marion Walker has shown the various ways that was done, including using angling as a catch cry. Finally, related to point 5, countless visitors had described Tasmania as the most English of the Australian colonies, and it continued to develop its Englishness after 1860 as one of many ways of removing the hated stain of convictism and attracting immigrants and visitors. English novelist Anthony Trollope put it the strongest after his visit in 1871 too. Everything in Tasmania is more English than is England herself. Introducing game animals for hunting like hares and deer contributed to the Englishness of Tasmania, but those animals, another refrain here, caused damage to agriculture and the environment as well. So lack of time precludes discussion of the fish acclimatisation program, especially of salmonidae, which succeeded in acclimatising trout, but not the more prized salmon in the second half of the 19th century. It should be noted here that the Tasmanian government, supported by the Royal Society of Tasmania, did invest heavily in salmonidae acclimatisation because it had the potential to be exported to other colonies, to create employment, to attract Angler tourists, and in terms of cultivating the image of Englishness, as one commentator put it, to confer a prominence and distinction on Tasmania which cannot be anticipated from almost any other source. And a book or person, and a book you might know, is probably a really good account of fish developments. Private acclimatisers like MORTON ALLPORT with perch and Captain William Langdon with tench invested time and money to achieve what acknowledged piscator Judge Henry Ralph Francis of New South Wales called a triumph of acclimatisation. Acclimatisers underestimated the impact of introduced fish on native fish species, however. While sources for understanding the divisions and debates arising from salmonidae acclimatisation are plentiful, if at times tendentious, hardly any sources exist for the Tas or for major acclimatisers, but newspapers, swept up in the possibilities of acclimatisation, frequently reported on new importations and their impact. So I'll just briefly mention what happened before 1862 and then go into more detail on the Tas's exploits before looking at problems. So very early on there was an interest in this introducing British games, so the Tasmanian Game Association in 1826, for example. In 1859, the MHA for Oaklands, Henry Frampton Anstey, wanted more effort put into protecting the animals that were brought in and bring more animals to Tasmania, really benefiting wealthy farmers and landowners. And that led the next year to the Protection of Imported Game Act. So those, as you can see there, pheasants, partridges, etc., were all protected for 5 years, and you could be fined for killing them per animal or bird. And as Graves said, this was an attempt to make Tasmania as near as possible like old England. Well, Anstey's successor as a member for Oaklands in the House of Assembly, James McLanigan, set an example by releasing pheasants into the shrubberies adjoining his property at Ballochmyle near Tunbridge. The Mercury urged other wealthy magnates to follow McLanigan's example and make their mansions and grounds still more ornamental and attractive by the introduction of British game. So then what about the Tasmanian Acclimatisation Society? Well, as mentioned earlier, scientific societies were one possible vehicle for acclimatisation in the Australian colonies, and the Royal Society of Tasmania was one organisation that showed an interest in acclimatisation, received donations of publications from acclimatisation societies around the world, but it did not play a central role in the late 19th century. So while the TAS concentrated on introducing new animals more for sport than increasing the food supply, the Royal Society's main focus was on exchanging plants and seeds with acclimatisation societies in various colonies and abroad. Now, in February 1872, the Mercury judged that the chief aim of Royal Society Fellows was not, as some alleged, to flatter their own vanity, but to encourage scientific discoveries and promote acclimatisation and the culture of vegetable products suitable to the climate. So whether by the Royal Society at its botanic gardens, by individuals or by accident, many useful plants and not so useful weeds from other places made their appearance in Tasmania by the 1870s. Well, the two members of the Royal Society of Tasmania were also members of the TAS, but their differences were more interesting than their similarities. One was MORTON ALLPORT, a Hobart lawyer, an enthusiastic naturalist, respected for his knowledge of Tasmanian zoology and botany. As one obituarist said, loving science truly as being the handmaid of nature. He became a member of the Royal Society of Tasmania in 1849 and published a number of articles in that society's papers and proceedings. He corresponded widely with scientific men in Europe and was made a Fellow of the Linnean and Zoological Societies in London and a foreign member of various European scientific societies. While his letter books show that he sent many specimens of mammals, birds, molluscs, seeds and insects and Aboriginal body parts to European museums, his main acclimatisation objective was with English fish, as mentioned earlier. And for that he was made an honorary life member of the Otago Acclimatisation Society and the Zoological and Acclimatisation Society of Victoria. Like ALLPORT, John Woodcock Graves was a lawyer whose keen interest in animals dominated his later life, but his links with the Royal Society were more tenuous than ALLPORT's. Described by an anonymous obituarist as learned, genial and eccentric, he was a thorough sportsman in hunting game and was passionately fond of greyhounds, which he bred. Now, he remained secretary of the TAS long after it appeared to have become defunct, and did a lot to protect native animals. And one of the things he did was write anonymously for the Mercury. So a lot of the editorials that push acclimatisation were probably written by Graves, and I'll give you an example of that when I get a chance. The thing that I thought might be interesting as a diversion, are we allowed a diversion? Yes, you want a diversion? Graves strongly denounced the early settlers for having assisted to exterminate the blacks, that's a quote, and took the warmest interest in the welfare of Truganini, even naming his second daughter after her in 1864. Well, a turning point for acclimatisation came in January 1862 when the proprietor of the Melbourne Argus, Edward Wilson, of the ASV, spoke at a meeting of people interested in the acclimatisation of animals in Tasmania. Calling acclimatisation a very great idea, Wilson marvelled at the wide range of useful animals that could be introduced into Australia. He had no doubt that there were many various animals which would add to our happiness, our comfort and our enjoyment in some form or another. But no systematic scheme of acclimatisation had been carried out in Australia. So he contended that in looking at the list of animals useful to man, they should not be limited to wealth-producing animals. The happiness of children would be much expanded if they were surrounded with the various beautiful forms of animal life, which must necessarily have an improving and elevating tendency. How much would it lighten the toilsomeness of a wayfarer's journey if he saw around him the various engaging forms of animated nature, the fish sporting in the river, the birds caroling in the trees, and an endless variety of objects. While most attention had been devoted to salmon and alpacas, Wilson knew he courted ridicule by lauding the qualities of lesser species of fireflies like fireflies and glowworms. Sheep farmers who regarded sheep as sacred, as they did in Tasmania, opposed the introduction of alpacas as a way of superseding sheep. But Wilson claimed acclimatisation was not about superseding, but adding to a colony's wealth, and alpacas could feed over the head of the sheep and eat what the sheep would not. Wilson asserted that the essence of acclimatisation was to choose animals that would not prey on each other, but derive their sustenance from varying herbage and avoid what he called an acrimonious struggle. As for who should carry out acclimatisation schemes, Wilson advocated the necessity of conjoint aid from public and private sources. But what was far more important than money was to attract men whose hearts were in the cause and to appoint an equally interested honorary secretary. So they needed one too. Once public interest grew, government grants of land and money and donations of animal life would follow. So following this meeting, the TAS was formed on the model of the ASV. A lot of prominent men associated with the Royal Society of Tasmania, Dr. Robert Officer, ALLPORT, Premier T.D. Chapman, James Agnew, etc., all were there. ALLPORT, interestingly, wanted the TAS to be a branch of the Royal Society and the committee of the Royal Society to be the committee of the TAS. But without giving a specific reason, the meeting decided to operate independently of the Royal Society, but the two bodies would assist each other where possible. And so the early members or subscribers included 2 Supreme Court judges, 8 members of the Legislative Council, 10 members of the House of Assembly, clergymen, farmers, pastoralists, lawyers, doctors and businessmen, including the owner of the Mercury, John Davies, all upper-class members of society or aspirants to that exalted status in Davies' case. And Chapman did his best to get the new society off the ground. He moved in the House of Assembly. Let's give them £100 on the condition that they raise £200 of their own. Because, he said, the Assembly stood in the position of landlord of one of the finest estates possible, and the grant would help raise the value of the land by introducing European birds and animals. The other members didn't agree, pointed out that we were going through a depression. We didn't have money to waste on what looked like a fad, and so that didn't work very well. Major newspapers were more encouraging. The Advertiser thought increasing domestic animals would provide employment for a growing population and increase exports. Introducing European singing birds would change the silence and the loneliness of our bush for the music and hilarity of English groves. And had great visions of making the hitherto useless western districts of Tasmania useful by sending alpacas there, and also wanted the Japanese silkworm to come so a silk industry could develop. Mercury was more interested in more systematic acclimatisation, so that's why it was so interested in acclimatisation. But without government support, the efforts of individuals like ALLPORT, wrote Mercury, would be instrumental in renewing our acquaintance with many once familiar forms of animal life of the old world. And an even more committed acclimatiser, Graves, already moved quickly by placing a pair of white swans on Southport Narrows and a pair of pheasants on Partridge Island and Huon Island. So the TAS proceeded to outline its objectives at length by adopting those of the ASV, which in turn was largely based on the British Society's objectives. And these included the introduction, acclimatisation and domestication of all innocuous quadrupeds, birds, fishes, insects and vegetables, whether useful or ornamental, and the spread of indigenous animals from parts of the colonies where they were already known to other localities where they were not known. And it had big, grand visions of exchanging as gifts with other acclimatisation societies around the world, including the British one, was going to hold regular meetings, was going to publish a journal, a carbon copy of what the Royal Society was doing. But no scientific investigation or report was ever completed as far as I can tell. Certainly reports and correspondence were invited from similar societies around the world and to give the wider scope to acclimatisation in Tasmania. And they would also reward, honorary and otherwise, people who helped them. And one of the type of people who helped were captains of vessels. So captains of vessels would often bring animals and birds and fish out on behalf of TAS and individuals. So there was some work done, arranged with the Royal Society to build aviaries in the Botanic Gardens, donated pamphlets on acclimatisation to public libraries in Hobart and Launceston, but not really very much initially. And evidence is lacking on how the wider public reacted to the idea of acclimatisation that appealed to so many men of wealth and property. Probably most Tasmanians, shall I say, were beastly careless and thought acclimatisation was a fad that would pass, but others were less sanguine and advocated preemptive action to stop acclimatisation. One outspoken critic called Pro Bono Publico felt moved to express his views after seeing an 1862 Advertiser report that Graves intended to import 2 foxes and that 2 native or koala bears had been set free in the gullies of Mount Wellington. Pro Bono Publico thought the mania for importing foreign animals may possibly increase and called on Parliament to pass laws preventing individuals or societies from acting as they please in such matters. So while he condoned the importation of harmless creatures, it was monstrous to suppose that any man at his pleasure should import ravenous beasts or vermin of any description. And Pro Bono Publico pointed out that fox hunting was not regarded as a boon for farmers in England and hoped that Graves would prosecute himself if his foxes should happen to trespass on the poultry of his neighbour. He used to live at Caldew in top of Dolphin Street, that area there. Well, they had to rely on private subscriptions, which really meant they couldn't do very much. ALLPORT was quickly falling out of favour with acclimatisation, said the association was falling to pieces, but remained a contact point for outside inquiries. In 1863, the Acclimatisation Society of the United Kingdom wanted to find out about the progress of acclimatisation in the British Empire, and its president, the Duke of Newcastle, who was Secretary of State for the Colonies, sent a circular dispatch dated 7th of August to ministers, governors and consuls around the world, containing a survey of 10 questions, in part drawn up by Edward Wilson. And ALLPORT responded on behalf of the TAS. So the first 8 questions sought knowledge about Tasmanian quadrupeds, birds, fish, insects, timber trees, medicinal plants and vegetables that might be useful to Britain. And of these, most revealing was question 1 on quadrupeds. So ALLPORT nominated the brush, or I think we know it as the forester kangaroo, I'm not sure about that, but anyway, as of the most economic value as its skin made very superior leather that added that, like most of our indigenous marsupial quadrupeds, this animal is fast disappearing before the creatures introduced from Europe. And as we will see, Allport did have real qualms about acclimatisation, but he could hardly express them in this response to the Duke of Newcastle. So he concluded that attempting to acclimatise the brush kangaroo amongst animals of higher organisation will fail. Question 9 asks what introductions would most benefit Tasmania. Unsurprisingly, Allport thought any of the game, songbirds or large freshwater fish belonging to the northern temperate zone would be valuable, but he feared that the future of the Tas was too uncertain to render it helpful in acclimatisation work. And so in September 1864, he's telling people the Tas has died, it's no longer active. In future, all acclimatisation work will be carried out by the Royal Society of Tasmania. As I say, that wasn't quite true. For example, salmon acclimatisation was carried out by salmon commissioners, and Graves became the figurehead of the Tas, privately introducing a range of animals into Tasmania until his death in 1876, when the Tas faded from view. But the mercury kept the vision alive. So let me just quote a very flowery editorial in 1868 from the Mercury. Acclimatisation was unquestionably beneficial in an utilitarian sense, but also promoted healthful and morally and intellectually improving enjoyment. Among the highest privileges man could possess was the ability to introduce living creatures where they were previously unknown, to adapt them by judicious culture to novel conditions of climate and soil, and above all, to so improve them by systematic and appropriate admixtures of blood as to render the product of art and nature, in combination, superior to the work of nature alone. So the acclimatisers, continued the Mercury, ministered to both physical wants and the refined pleasures of mankind. One lesson to be revealed by the study of nature's book was that no creature or product was without its use and application in the great scheme of the universe. Mercury's core point, though, was that acclimatisation was to a great extent the necessary complement of high civilization. When Anglo-Saxons fulfilled their destiny and subdued new wildernesses, they must transplant any animals, plants or fish or birds adapted to their homes in new lands. So that editorial does bear some hallmarks of Graves' zealotry, so this might have been one of his. Now, apart from money, apart from lack of support, one reason that the acclimatisers often gave for the failure of acclimatisation was that Tasmanians were addicted to killing anything that moved. So if you brought them, pheasants and so on, someone would kill it sooner or later. And the other thing that they also complained about was what one called the predatory prowlings of the domestic cat. So how do you get around that? So one idea they had was, let's go to small islands around the southern Tasmania and begin breeding on those islands. So Betsy Island, Green Island, Sloping Island, or Sloping Island, were used, and quite a bit happened on those islands, which I can't go into today. And I can't also go into the various private individuals who were also equally addicted to acclimatisation, and did a lot to introduce a whole range of British game birds and animals, songbirds and birds to control pests. And there was certainly more activity than one might expect, with exchanges with Victoria, New Zealand and even Ceylon. But too often, the end seemed to be to kill animals and birds rather than further understanding of their value or otherwise, and the value or otherwise of acclimatisation to Tasmania. So let me bring the talk to a conclusion by talking about the more critical assessments, questioning Wilson's idea that acclimatisation was a very great idea. Even some acclimatisers had decided reservations about aspects of acclimatisation, which MIT historian Harriet Ritvo described as a kind of Pandora's box. MORTON ALLPORT expressed a number of concerns in private correspondence as early as 1864. One concern was how domestic cats, rabbits and rats forced native marsupials to be driven off their grounds. Another concern, again this is in writing in letters, was the ludicrous and mischievous suggestion by William Thomas Owen, Honorary Secretary of the Wellington Acclimatisation Society, that the migratory snipe be acclimatised in New Zealand. ALLPORT wondered how were they to be caught, fed and transplanted, and what did he mean to do with them when he got them? He was even more damning of the recent attempt to ship foxes to Tasmania. Luckily they all died on the voyage out, as many of these fish and animals did, but he could not think of a more truly mischievous importation, only equalled by the willful introduction of the Scotch thistle. And he was similarly unflattering about sending things the other way. You know, kangaroos, wombats, bandicoots and laughing jackasses to Europe, which he called a wild species of idiocy, which it would be hopeless to try to cure. But in an 1867 paper delivered to the Royal Society of Tasmania, ALLPORT traded contempt for critical analysis. He contended that it took so slight a change in the natural balance of creatures to settle the question of presence or absence of particular forms of life. Those interested in acclimatisation should study well the natural history and capabilities of the countries to which they wish to introduce new creatures before they spend much time or much money in their experiments. In places where indigenous creatures had been extirpated, ALLPORT did see a positive role for acclimatisation in introducing and protecting animals of similar habits to those driven out. Otherwise, he was convinced the successful establishment of new creatures can only be accomplished at the expense of those already in possession of the ground. Same was true for new vegetables and plants. And on one point at least, ALLPORT should have taken his own advice. In Tony Harrison's book, he notes that in 1858, ALLPORT contributed to a disastrous ecological impact by acclimatising European carp in the rivers of southern Australia. A really more interesting assessment, and the only woman who really seemed to have commented on this was someone you'll know. Oh, sorry, I meant to show you that. Starling distribution, I meant to show you that. I meant to show you that. Now I want to show you this. Someone you know very well. And, Louisa Ann Meredith gave a very visceral and class-based criticism of acclimatisation. Now, she not only was involved with the Royal Society, but she was very prominent in the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. She was their leading light. And she denounced acclimatisation in 1887 as at best but a presumptuous experiment, quite as often mischievous as successful. Overwrought by the untold numbers of rabbits killed by poisoning, she condemned the small number of wealthy, educated, influential men who call themselves Christians too, who killed by means which torture by lingering agony, intense beyond the power of words to describe. They killed not a solitary individual, but millions of poor little beasts to be not placed in these lands by their creator, but which were introduced by men for their own diversions and benefits. This positive evil was the natural result of ignorant human interference with the all-wise designs of God. Now, Meredith acknowledged, like most Tasmanians would have, that introducing rabbits was a serious mistake which required many methods to be adopted for their destruction. Some methods involved short suffering and left the bodies and skins fit to be utilised for human food and profitable manufactures. But the legalised brutality, in her words, legalised brutality of poisoning was a gigantic sin which dealt wholesale destruction to every living thing within reach of it. Insectivorous birds, those God-given protectors of agricultural and gardening industries. She blamed the large landholders, the wool kings, offenders against religion and morality, for using poisoning to protect their sheep runs and making themselves lords of wastes and princes of deserts at the expense of small tenants. And the retributive result of which, avarice, comes in the shape of rabbits. But others criticised too. Noting the failure of acclimatisation in New Zealand, America and Tasmania, the Mercury drew the lesson in 1890, the Mercury, that whenever we seek to interfere with the wise provisions of Dame Nature, we only display how woefully ignorant we are of the result that is likely to flow from our action. One writer called Tasmanian, writing in the Tasmanian News, the Mercury's rival at the time, pointed out the example of English birds introduced to destroy insect pests that not only drove away native birds who kept down the insects, but multiplied quickly, preferred to attack fruit in orchards, not insects, and threatened the viability of fruit growing. Tasmanian cited other regrettable examples and declaimed, "Oh, acclimatisation, what evil has been wrought to Tasmania by thy name." That's the only Shakespeare I can do, sorry. Some commentators did not oppose the idea of acclimatisation, but it's unthinking practice. So, railing against indiscreet acclimatisation in 1892, the Launceston Examiner advocated placing acclimatisation under the control of a government department, which would make proper and diligent inquiries to prevent that which had proved to be a pest in other lands being firmly established in our own. And one out-and-out scientific, some of the scientific credentials, the authoritative bird expert William Vincent LEGGE, author of The Birds of Ceylon, and a strenuous acclimatiser in his day, advised in 1895 that before any animal or bird was introduced into a new country, the following obvious questions should be asked. Is the climate suitable? Is the food taken by the species existent in the country? And will any harm result from the proposed introduction? So that last and most difficult question was impossible to answer for the trial and error acclimatisers with rudimentary scientific knowledge. So you'd think, with that criticism, with the experience they've had, that that'd be the end of acclimatisation, wouldn't you? No? Yes? Hands up. Hands up. Yes? No. So it wasn't. Acclimatisation did have a resurgence in the 1890s, but in different circumstances from the 1860s, and with a renewed emphasis on game protection, a sign of greater appreciation of native wildlife. And so this was illustrated with the formation, guess where, in the Royal Society's room, of the Game Protection and Acclimatisation Society in April 1895. And at the main meeting, talk soon turned to familiar topics such as the introduction of the New Zealand paradise duck and the English wood pigeon. But the main aim of the new society was to prevent really beautiful, harmless native birds from becoming extinct. But even further, in the 1890s, acclimatisation had been confined mainly to Hobart. There was a northern society that briefly operated, but in the 1890s we get another northern society being established in March 1899, the Acclimatisation Society of Northern Tasmania, and in September 1899, we get the West Coast Acclimatisation Society, which intended to introduce fish and songbirds. So, curator and secretary of the Tasmanian Museum and Botanical Gardens, Alexander MORTON, attended the September meeting on the West Coast and offered his assistance. In this new phase of the acclimatisation experiment, MORTON advised the West Coasters to be careful what birds they introduced, as trouble might be caused in the future if a variety like the sparrow got too plentiful. He suggested that they should contact LEGGE, the greatest authority on ornithology in the Australian colonies. Now, this sage advice showed that something had been learned since 1860, but what impact this new 1890s phase of acclimatisation had on Tasmania's agriculture and environment. Well, you know what? That's a story for another day. Thank you.